The president of Azerbaijan has called for a snap election in February. The announcement by Ilham Aliyev comes after Azerbaijan recaptured the breakaway region of Nagorno Karabakh from Armenian separatists in September. The area was historically home to a majority of ethnic Armenians who had operated autonomously and even formed their own government. Most of the region's 120,000 population fled to neighbouring Armenia following its recapture by Azerbaijan. Let's pick this up then with Richard Giragosian, who's head of the Regional Studies Centre. That's a foreign policy think tank. Welcome back to DW. Let's start with that snap election called by the president of Azerbaijan. Why do you think he's done that?
Well, I do think it's also a mistake because the president of Azerbaijan has been ruling the country in 4 terms as president for over 20 years. I think the real reason he's pushing ahead is a sense of victory, the use of force. He has finally stepped out of the shadow of his father. And I do think this is related to an increase in a risk of hostilities.
Right. OK, so we won that. So let me see if I can legitimise my rule by saying, OK, we'll go to the electorate now as a victor. So now we have reports of sporadic gunfire on the border region, around Nagorno Karabakh. Do you think this conflict is likely to reignite?
Well, there is a very real risk of renewed hostilities, simply because there's no effective deterrence. The European Union has deployed monitors along the more vulnerable southern Armenian border, but we've had, unfortunately, yet another casualty just days ago when an Azerbaijani sniper took out and murdered an Armenian soldier. So I think the risk is real, but unfortunately, we have no partner for peace in terms of a return to diplomacy that is needed most.
Right. So just to be clear, so when the fighting stopped back in September and we saw all those pictures of thousands of people making their way to Armenia, that was more a sort of recognition of the facts on the ground rather than a deal having been done. And the peace negotiations are continuing. Is that right?
Yes. And the dangerous precedent here is seemingly vindicated and validated the use of force. The forced expulsion of over 100,000 Armenians from Nagorno-Karabakh does little to inspire confidence in diplomacy, or democracy for that matter. This is why the family dynasty within Azerbaijan, the more it continues, the more of a threat it poses to a struggling democracy in Armenia.
OK, so those peace talks between Azerbaijan and Armenia do appear to have stalled. And what are the stumbling blocks?
Well, Phil, to be honest, it's not just stalling. It's Azerbaijan's refusal to participate. For the past 3 scheduled meetings in Brussels, Washington, and Grenada, we've had Azerbaijan boycott. In other words, from an Armenian perspective, we simply need a partner for peace. And Azerbaijan is increasingly diplomatically isolated, leading to the frustration of both the EU and the United States.
Right. And a final question on the role of the Armenian Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan. That conflict, the conflict back in September, that almost forced him out of office. How do Armenians see him now?
Well, I would put it in the opposite way. The government of Nikol Pashinyan, the Prime Minister of Armenia, was re-elected in 2020 despite losing the war. The early elections of 2021 gave him a mandate to govern. But I do think the bigger problem of political accountability is the real loss for Armenia started decades ago in terms of missed opportunities. And we do need much more strategic vision and leadership than we've had to date.
OK, that's very clear. Thank you so much. Richard Giragosian from the Regional Studies Centre.
Thank you, Phil.